You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm joined by Dr. Bernard Crespi, a professor of evolutionary biology at the Simon Fraser University in Canada. His research studies how the genetic influences of mental health diseases can be analyzed from an evolutionary biology perspective, as well as revealing insights for modern psychiatry. I'm very excited to learn more about his interdisciplinary work in this field. Thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk a little bit about your work. I'm really looking forward to all of the topics that you've researched and discussing those and thinking more about the specifics there. But first of all, I'd love to just ask you a bit about your background and your research interests.
Right. Well, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I began my research career studying the social behavior of insects, and then I switched over to the social behavior of humans, and that got me very interested in the disorders of social behavior in humans, which include many of the most prominent psychiatric disorders like autism and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression. So I'm at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver in biology, where I've been for a bit over 25 years.
Wow, that's a really long time to be researching into such a very specific discipline, but also it's so important these days as we start to learn a bit more about all of these different psychiatric disorders and their different causes. And I thought, exactly like you mentioned, I would love to ask you a little bit about which are the psychiatric disorders that we know are influenced by genetic factors that we can now study in these new ways.
Well, that would be all of them. Virtually all psychiatric disorders have been subject to genetic and genomic studies, and they're all found to have a partial genetic basis. I mean, we knew that going into it. We knew that there was heritability of the disorders, but now we have a much better idea of the genes that underlie the heritability. Now, how much is genes, how much is environment, how much is interactions between the two, that depends on the disorder, but there's substantial contributions from all three of those.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular disorders that are often widely studied in this field that are the subject of a lot of recent research?
Well, I'm most interested in autism and schizophrenia, and that's because they are the disorders that are most closely linked up with human social behavior. They represent alterations to social behavior. So those are the ones that I find most fascinating and that I've been focusing on.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting how you mentioned with these disorders, obviously they play a big part of our social behavior and they can have a massive impact on people's lives. But it's interesting how you mentioned that we somewhat knew for a long time that they were linked to, say, genetics and genomics and had these hereditary factors, but it took us a longer time to identify the specifics of which, say, genes were actually involved. And on that topic, are there any other ways where the ways we've been thinking about these diseases, like autism or schizophrenia, are there any other ways that our understanding of them has really rapidly changed over the past, say, few decades?
The main changes in the past couple of decades have come from both genomics and neuroscience. Those are the two areas that have been advancing very rapidly in terms of the technology, in terms of what can be measured, in terms of the sample sizes, the numbers of individuals who can be studied. So the progress has been driven in large part by technology. It's possible to take a genome and essentially sequence it in a matter of hours to days now, and one has vast amounts of information, and then the hard part becomes making sense of that information.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to using these novel techniques to study these disorders, what is the insight that studying the genetic influences of these disorders that can be revealed to us that, say, past methods haven't been able to?
Well, there's two main insights there. One of them is that we know that there is a large set of rare genetic alterations that have a big impact on risk of, say, autism or schizophrenia. And these could be changes to quite important genes. These could be a loss or gain of a big chunk of DNA. And these changes are quite rare. They might be in one in 5,000 or 1 in 20,000 individuals, but they have a big effect on the risk of the disorder. So one can say that these genetic changes are quite clearly causal, and one can sequence a genome, and if one finds one of these big changes, one can kind of point to those and say, well, this is the cause of the disorder. The other type of genetic variation that's important is variation that has very small effects and that involves many, many genes. So we now know, say, for schizophrenia, that there are thousands of genes involved. And for each of those genes, there's variation, so that someone who has one allele might have a 1% higher risk of, say, schizophrenia or autism. And this is true for a very large number of genes. So one can, again, sequence the genome and look at all of these sites, all of these spots in the DNA sequence where you have these small effects on risk, and add them up to get an overall genetic risk score for something like schizophrenia. So some people would have many schizophrenia risk alleles, and some would have few. And this can be a very useful way of sorting out what factors are associated with risk of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm. Just with that introduction to the complexity of how these studies are conducted and how rare sometimes it can be to find the alleles that make some tiny differences versus the ones that are incredibly rare in populations, it must create some challenges in terms of the amount of, as you mentioned, the sample sizes of people that you must recruit for studies, or the even the computational power or the lab work and just sheer time that it requires to go identify these alleles. So I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges involved there. I'm sure, like in your specific research, there must have been some challenges that came about as you started to work with genetic technology for the first time in designing new studies.
Right. Well, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm not a geneticist or a genomicist or a bioinformatics sort of person. And I practice what one could call evolutionary medicine. So I'm bringing a very different perspective to these questions than you get from being a specialized genomics person. So in my lab, for example, we take the results of the genomic studies and we try to make sense of them. So for example, there are certain alleles, certain small effect genetic variation that influences, say, autism risk or schizophrenia risk. And we want to know what those alleles do in typical populations. So for a given spot in the genome, there's a couple of alleles, and one of them increases schizophrenia risk. For one of them, the risk is a little higher. For one of them, the risk is a little lower. But what exactly are those alleles doing in typical individuals? Are they involved in attention? Are they involved in creativity? Are they involved in language? It's important to understand the adaptive basis of those differences in order to make sense of the genetic basis of the disorder as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting how you explain that, because oftentimes when people think about the work of evolutionary biologists, it seems to be that the research would be focused on, say, studying past societies, say, past cultures, and how people behaved and their biology, and taking evidence from, say, fossils to study genes in the past. But as you just described it, it somewhat seems like the approach with evolutionary biology, it can be equally applicable to the now. So taking evidence from evolutionary biology, taking those insights, but also thinking about what that means for present societies based on our current research of the results we're getting from genomics. Could you talk a little bit about how the process of discovery might be involved, where you might take new evidence from current societies and then use that to extrapolate past insights, or whether it works in reverse, or whether there's some of both?
Right. Well, the type of evolutionary biology that I do is not focused as much on trying to understand the past, which is very, very, very difficult because the evidence that you can get is tends to be quite scant. But one can also, using evolutionary methods, look at variation and its effects in current populations. And this involves the study of adaptation. So we can think about the disorders like autism and schizophrenia as representing forms of maladaptation. So there's a lack of fit to the environment. But the question then becomes, if you have these maladaptations, then what are the adaptations that have gone wrong? So, for example, we've done some work on intelligence. So humans have clearly evolved much higher intelligence than virtually all other organisms, and this is an adaptation clearly of humans, probably our most important one overall. And this adaptation can become dysregulated. So the development and expression of intelligence can go wrong essentially in different ways during development. And so we've been able to show, for example, that one can consider autism in part as a disorder of high intelligence, but also imbalanced intelligence. So one essentially can take intelligence and ramp up certain parts of it so they're highly developed, but other parts of intelligence are less well developed. And then you get various traits that are characteristic of autism. So that would be one way of relating the evolutionary adaptations to the maladaptations of the disorders.
Mm-hmm. And in that context, would it also be fair to say that this type of analysis, it could yield insights into how humans might evolve these traits through the passing down of different alleles and genes?
Absolutely. One, for example, there are these elements in the genome, these repetitive elements that have been discovered by a fellow in Colorado named Jim Sikela. And these elements, different people have different numbers of copies. And the number of copies that people have is related to their brain size, and it's related to their intelligence, and it's also related to their risks of autism. And one can also compare the number of copies between different species of primates. And there it also relates to aspects of brain development as well. So one can look at the genetic basis of some of these adaptations, like intelligence or brain size, and using phylogenies and the study of evolutionary trajectories, one can begin to link up the disorders to evolutionary changes that essentially potentiated the disorders or created the risk of the disorders.
Mm-hmm. And this seems like an incredible kind of power. I'm sure that there must be a lot of applications that can stem from this, whether it be with, say, the medical field in applied medicine or just monitoring population health over time in our present society.
There are some applications. There's probably less than one might think. So all the study in genomics, it's been the rare variants, these rare genetic factors, they've been very useful in helping people to understand the causes of the disorders in specific individuals. But they haven't been useful to speak of yet, anyway, in terms of developing therapies. They are a clear step on the way, but the problem with developing therapies is that you really need to have a fairly good idea of how the brain works. And we don't know that yet. So the information about genetic factors that are involved, it has many uses, but the uses for developing, say, new drugs, new therapies, those are not going to come along until we have a better idea of how we can develop drugs to alter the brain in particular predictive ways. And that's going to take a while.
Mm-hmm. And are the barriers there more to do with how we study the brain, with how we, say, test what the effect of factor A is on this function of the brain? Or is it more to do with just not understanding the fundamentals to begin with?
Well, I think the most straightforward answer there is to point out that the brain is almost certainly the most complex structure with the most complex function that we know of in the universe. Billions upon billions of connections between neurons that change during development, and we need to understand what's going on all the way from the level of genes, the large scale electrical neuronal networks. So we have to connect up between genes and neurodevelopment and psychology and thinking and language. We have to work across all of those levels. And that means that one needs to essentially integrate all of that information in some way. So you have thousands upon thousands of genes that are interacting in very complicated ways through development. And mathematically, the structure of that problem is just fantastically complex.
Mm-hmm. And is it the case that oftentimes in academia, when people are studying these different levels of everything from how genes affect the way, say, neurons work and how the neurons interact together, to all the way up to how all of these different mechanisms in our brain influence the way we behave? Is there a disconnect between people studying across all of these levels and meshing together theories to see what causes what and creating a more complete understanding of the brain?
Well, the problem does come from specialization. So we have scientists who work in all of these different silos, as it were, from genetics to development to physiology to neuroscience to psychology to psychiatry. And each of those disciplines has its own quite specialized methods and its own sorts of concepts and its own histories. And to be able to put those different levels together, one needs to have long-term and deep training in multiple levels. So it takes people who are willing to essentially stretch themselves across disciplines, which becomes more and more difficult as the fields become more and more technological and more complex.
It really gives me an appreciation of how complicated your work must be to consider all of these different influences across these fields together. And on that note, I wanted to ask you about, from your unique perspective, from having studied everything from genome expression to evolutionary biology to how that translates into psychiatric disorders today, I wanted to ask you about, with all of these different disciplines, what are some of the key gaps in your knowledge that you're looking forward to seeing more work on in the next 5 years? And what are you personally just more excited to work on in the next little while?
Well, that's a good question, because there's the known unknowns and there's the unknown unknowns. What I would like to see personally is evolutionary biology permeating these different disciplines more thoroughly. There's a great divide between people using evolutionary approaches and people using mechanistic and proximate types of approaches. That is an area where there is a long-term need for integration between the areas. As far as what research I'd like to see done, well, I'm very interested in some of these large-scale models of how the brain works, the large-scale sorts of neural network and other models, artificial intelligence and big data, and trying to kind of work from the top, from the advances in computer science to see, well, can we make something that behaves like a human brain, and in that way try to understand its large-scale structure.
Mm-hmm. And I really find it interesting that you still have the perspective of what are the known unknowns and what are the unknown unknowns. So it just goes to show how interesting this field is and how much development that is still going on in the academia. So it'll be very interesting to keep an eye out for new developments here. And for anyone listening who's interested in this area and learning more about your specific work or just learning about evolutionary biology in general, are there any ways that they can find your work or any other interesting resources?
The easiest way would just be to Google me. There's a lot of my papers that are available online, and most of them I hope are reasonably comprehensible. There's a number of excellent books on evolutionary medicine by people like Randy Nesse, one of the founders of the field. And these would probably be the best ways.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I wanted to thank you for taking the time to explain some of the details behind how evolutionary biology works and some of the applications that it has with all of these other interesting fields. And I really appreciate you giving us an idea of what the most exciting areas for work are in this field in the next little while, and some of the reasons why we should have more attention being put here.
Well, thank you for having me on today.